Welcome to Life Stories, where we share heartfelt tales of love, forgiveness, and the resilience of the human spirit. Today's story takes you on an emotional journey of a young woman, Emily, who was cast out by her father, Michael, after a moment of anger changed their lives forever. Years later, a life-threatening situation brings them face to face with the pain of the past and the possibility of redemption. Can forgiveness mend a broken bond? Can love and compassion heal old wounds? Stay with us as we unravel this touching story. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. The door creaked ominously, its sound reverberating through the stillness of the house that night. The storm outside was a mere whisper compared to the tempest brewing within. Michael, a middle-aged man with piercing grey eyes and a face hardened by life's trials, stormed into his daughter Emily's room. His heavy footsteps thudded against the hardwood floors, each one carrying the weight of his fury and disappointment. Emily, just 16, sat frozen on her bed. Her golden curls framed a face etched with anxiety, her blue eyes wide with fear. Her trembling hands clutched the crumpled report card that had set everything in motion. She had been dreading this moment since she received her grades, knowing full well how her father would react. The air felt suffocating, thick with tension, as if the very walls were bracing for what was to come. Without a word, Michael snatched the paper from her hands. His eyes blazed with fury as they scanned the grades, stopping at the C in mathematics. His face turned crimson, and the veins on his neck bulged as he let out a roar. "AC. Do you understand how this affects your chances of getting into a good college?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the small room. "I didn't raise my daughter to be ordinary." Emily's voice, trembling with emotion, broke the silence. "Dad, please. I tried my best." The new teacher. But Michael cut her off, his voice cold and unforgiving. "Excuses," he spat. "That's all you ever have. Excuses. You've wasted your potential, Emily. Wasted it." He turned abruptly to her closet, yanking open the doors and pulling clothes from the hangers with a ferocity that made her flinch. Emily leapt to her feet, tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to stop him. "Please, Dad. Don't do this. I can work harder. I can improve," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. But Michael was deaf to her cries. Years of unmet expectations and his own frustrations fueled his frantic movements. He tossed her belongings into a suitcase, his actions a reflection of the emotional storm raging inside him. As he zipped it shut, his voice came out in a sharp, cold tone that cut through the air like a knife. "You had your chance, Emily. Now you'll learn that in the real world, failure has consequences." Grabbing her arm, Michael dragged her down the stairs. Emily struggled to keep up, her mind spinning with disbelief and fear. This couldn't be happening, she thought. Not her father, the man who had once carried her on his shoulders and told her bedtime stories. At the front door, Michael threw the suitcase onto the rain-drenched sidewalk. Emily stood there, shivering, her heart pounding as the storm soaked her clothes. She made one final plea, her voice a mixture of rain and tears. "Dad, please don't do this. I have nowhere to go." Michael's eyes, cold as stone, met hers. "This will teach you the value of hard work and excellence. Don't come back until you're worthy of this family's name." And with that, he slammed the door, the sound echoing in Emily's ears like the closing of a coffin. She stood there, frozen, the reality of her situation sinking in with every passing second. The rain mingled with her tears as the world seemed to blur around her. With trembling legs, she picked up the suitcase and began walking, her thoughts a chaotic mixture of fear, anger, and sorrow. How could he do this, she whispered to herself, her voice nearly drowned out by the rain. "I'm his daughter. Am I really such a disappointment?" As she moved further from the house she had always called home, the gravity of her situation weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had no money, no plan, and nowhere to stay. The dark sky above seemed to mirror the storm within her, threatening an even fiercer deluge. Her steps faltered as she reached a nearby park, where she finally collapsed onto a wet bench. Clutching the suitcase to her chest like a shield, she allowed herself to break. The tears came freely now, flowing in sync with the rain that soaked her to the bone. Between sobs, she whispered into the emptiness of the night, "What am I going to do now? How can I survive alone?" Only the distant rumble of thunder answered her, a reminder of the vast, uncaring world that now lay before her. Emily sat there for what felt like hours, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The betrayal cut deeper than the cold. Her father, the one person who should have been her anchor, had cast her adrift. Eventually, the storm began to subside, leaving a damp, quiet stillness in its wake. But Emily's turmoil remained, an endless tempest within her soul. She knew she couldn't stay on that bench forever. With a deep breath that shook her entire frame, she stood, clutching her suitcase, and began walking into the unknown. The girl who had left her father's house that night was not the same girl who had grown up within its walls. That Emily had believed in unconditional love, in the safety of home, and in the strength of family bonds. But as she walked away from everything she had ever known, she realized that those beliefs had been shattered. Now, she was just a girl in the rain, searching for a new beginning. The rain had stopped by the time Emily reached the edge of the park, but the world around her still felt cold and unforgiving. Her clothes clung to her damp skin, and her suitcase dragged behind her, heavier with every step. She had no idea where she was going, only that she couldn't stop. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting the crushing reality of her situation. Hours passed as she wandered aimlessly through the city streets of Chicago, her once vivid surroundings now reduced to blurred shadows in her tired mind. The night stretched on, and exhaustion began to weigh her down. Her legs wobbled, her vision blurred, and her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. She eventually found herself slumped against the side of a convenience store, her suitcase beside her, too worn out to move another inch. It was there, under the flickering neon sign, that a stranger approached. Mary was a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and a soft voice that carried a warmth Emily hadn't felt in years. "Hey there. Are you okay?" Mary asked, crouching down to Emily's level. Emily didn't respond at first. She simply stared ahead, too drained to process what was happening. Mary's voice came again, gentle but firm. "You look like you've had a rough night. Can I help?" Something about the sincerity in her tone broke through Emily's fog. She looked up at Mary, her lips trembling as she whispered, "I have nowhere to go." Mary's face softened further, her expression a mixture of concern and compassion. "Let's get you out of the cold," she said, holding out her hand. Emily hesitated, her instincts telling her not to trust so easily. But what choice did she have? With trembling fingers, she took Mary's hand, and together, they walked toward a small apartment a few blocks away. Mary's home was modest but cozy, filled with the kind of warmth that came from years of care and love. The smell of freshly brewed tea wafted through the air as Mary guided Emily to the couch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You can stay here for as long as you need," Mary said, her tone steady and reassuring. That night, for the first time in hours, Emily allowed herself to relax. As she sipped the warm tea Mary had prepared, the heat spread through her body, easing the tension in her muscles. Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. Over the weeks that followed, Mary became more than a kind stranger to Emily. She became a mentor, a guide, and, in many ways, the mother figure Emily had always needed. Mary listened without judgment as Emily poured out her heart, sharing stories of her childhood, her struggles with school, and the impossible expectations her father had placed on her. "You're not a failure, Emily," Mary said one evening as they sat together in the small living room. You're just a girl who's been told she isn't good enough. But that's not true. You're stronger than you realize. Mary's words became a lifeline for Emily, pulling her out of the pit of self-doubt she had been trapped in. Slowly but surely, Emily began to rebuild. She found a part-time job at a local diner, saved up enough money to enroll in night classes, and discovered a resilience within herself that she never knew existed. As the years passed, Emily grew into a confident and determined young woman. She carried the scars of her past, but she refused to let them define her. Mary's unwavering support had taught her the power of kindness, empathy, and second chances. But despite all her progress, a part of Emily still felt the ache of her father's rejection. She told herself she had moved on, but deep down, she knew the wound had never fully healed. That's why, 7 years later, when her Aunt Linda called with news about Michael, the past came rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. Emily. Linda's voice was hesitant, as if she were unsure of how to deliver the news. Your dad, he's in the hospital. It's serious. The doctors don't think he has much time. Emily's breath caught in her throat. A mix of emotions, shock, anger, and a strange pang of concern rippled through her. She hadn't spoken to her father since that night, and the thought of seeing him again filled her with both dread and uncertainty. I don't know what to say, Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. After everything that happened, I just don't know. Linda sighed on the other end of the line. I understand, honey. But if you want to see him, I'll give you the hospital's location. It's your choice. Emily sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Finally, she said, Okay, give me the address. As she hung up the phone, Emily felt the world around her shift. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face her father. But one thing was clear, this was a journey she needed to take, no matter where it led. The drive to the hospital felt like traveling through a dream or perhaps a nightmare. The familiar streets of her childhood, the places she had walked and biked as a carefree girl, now seemed foreign and hollow. Emily gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she tried to steady her thoughts. The address her Aunt Linda had given her loomed in her mind like a destination she couldn't avoid but dreaded reaching. She parked in the hospital's lot, the grey concrete stretching endlessly before her. Sitting in the car, she stared at the building's glass entrance. It gleamed coldly under the midday sun, a stark contrast to the warmth she sought but feared she wouldn't find inside. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The hospital's interior was sterile and quiet, its walls lined with neutral tones meant to comfort but offering little solace. Emily approached the reception desk, her voice trembling as she spoke. I'm here to see Michael Johnson. He's my father. The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, as if they belonged to someone else. The receptionist glanced at her with a hint of sympathy before typing something into her computer. Room 418, she said, handing Emily a visitor's badge. Take the elevators to the 4th floor. Emily thanked her quietly and made her way to the elevator. As the doors slid shut and the floor numbers began to tick upward, she felt a familiar anxiety rising in her chest. Memories of her father's anger, his harsh words, and the sound of the door slamming behind her all came flooding back. She pressed her palms against the cold metal walls of the elevator, grounding herself. When the doors opened, Emily stepped into the 4th floor corridor, her eyes scanning the room numbers. Each step felt heavier than the last, her breath catching as she approached room 418. The door was partially ajar, and she could hear the rhythmic beeping of medical machines inside. Pushing the door open, she saw him. Michael lay in the hospital bed, a pale and frail version of the man she remembered. The sharp lines of his face had softened with age, his hair streaked with grey. Tubes and wires connected him to various monitors, the machines keeping time with the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, her emotions warring within her. Anger, sadness, and a faint flicker of compassion swirled together, leaving her unsure of what to feel. She had imagined this moment countless times over the years. But now that it was here, she didn't know what to say. "Emily," a voice called softly from behind her. She turned to see her Aunt Linda, her kind face etched with worry. "He doesn't know you're here. He's been in and out of consciousness. Do you want to go in?" Emily nodded hesitantly, her throat too tight to speak. Linda placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before stepping back to give her space. Taking a deep breath, Emily entered the room, pulling a chair close to the bed. For a moment, she simply sat there, studying her father's face. The man who had once seemed so imposing now looked small and vulnerable. "Dad," she said softly, the word feeling foreign after so many years. His eyelids fluttered, and after a moment, his grey eyes opened, unfocused at first before locking onto her. "Emily." His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. His eyes filled with a mix of surprise and something she couldn't quite place, guilt. "Perhaps. It's me," she said, her voice trembling. "I heard you were sick." Michael blinked, his expression wavering between disbelief and shame. Why are you here?" he croaked, his voice cracking under the weight of the question. Emily swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Because no matter what happened between us, you're still my father. And I thought maybe I could help." Tears welled in Michael's eyes, and for the first time, Emily saw a vulnerability in him she had never known. "I don't deserve your help," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily shook her head, her own tears beginning to fall. "Maybe not," she said quietly, "but I'm here anyway." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken pain of years of separation. For the first time in a long time, they were in the same room, not as adversaries but as two broken people trying to find their way back to one another. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Emily knew this was a step she had to take. The hours after Emily's first visit with Michael felt like a blur. The beeping machines, the sterile smell of the hospital, the hushed whispers of nurses in the hall, they all blended together as she tried to make sense of her emotions. Sitting in the waiting room, her Aunt Linda by her side, Emily replayed her father's frail voice in her head, his words still echoing, "I don't deserve your help." Linda broke the silence, her voice soft and careful. "Emily, the doctors said there's only one real chance to save him, a kidney transplant." Emily blinked, her thoughts snapping back to the present. "A transplant?" she asked, her voice distant, as if she were hearing the words through a fog. Linda nodded, her expression heavy with concern. "He's in critical condition, and the waiting list for donors is too long. They're hoping a close family member might be a match." Emily stared at her hands, her mind racing. She hadn't seen her father in 7 years. He had cast her out, left her to fend for herself in the rain. And now, here she was, being asked to consider giving him a part of herself, literally. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this." Linda reached for her hand, her touch grounding. "Emily, this is your choice. No one can make it for you. But just know, helping him doesn't erase what he did. It doesn't mean you have to forget. It just means you're choosing to do what feels right to you." Emily sat in silence, her aunt's words sinking in. Hours later, she found herself standing outside Michael's room once more. The decision she'd made felt heavy, but there was also a strange clarity in it. She pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit space. Michael's eyes opened slowly as she approached. "Emily," he said weakly, his voice laced with surprise. She hesitated before sitting down next to his bed. "Dad, the doctors said you need a kidney transplant." Michael nodded faintly, his expression clouded with exhaustion. "But it's too late. I'm not going to make it through the wait list." Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "What if I could help?" His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "Emily, No, he said firmly, though his voice lacked strength. I won't let you risk your life for me. After what I did to you. I don't deserve this. Maybe you don't, Emily replied, her voice steadier than she expected. But this isn't about what you deserve. It's about what I can live with. And I've decided I'll get tested. If I'm a match, I'll do it. Tears welled in Michael's eyes, spilling onto his weathered cheeks. You don't owe me this, Emily, he said, his voice breaking. I don't deserve your kindness. I took everything from you, your home, your safety, your childhood. How can you even look at me, let alone save me? Emily felt her own tears rising, but she forced herself to stay calm. You're right, Dad. You took a lot from me. And I'm not saying I've forgiven you, not completely. But Mary taught me something when she took me in. She told me forgiveness isn't about the other person, it's about freeing yourself. And maybe helping you is part of how I heal. Michael turned his face away, his shoulders trembling as he wept silently. For a moment, Emily just sat there, letting him process her words. The next few days were a whirlwind of tests, consultations, and paperwork. Emily learned she was a perfect match, and the transplant was scheduled as soon as possible. The doctors explained the risks. Surgery was never without its dangers, but Emily remained resolute. On the morning of the procedure, she found herself lying in a hospital bed, staring at the sterile ceiling above her. The anesthesiologist's calm voice reached her ears as he prepared to administer the medication. You're doing something incredibly brave, he said gently. Emily managed a faint smile, her nerves bubbling under the surface. I hope so, she replied. I just want him to have a chance. For both of us. As the anesthesia took hold, Emily's last thought before she drifted off was of the little girl she had once been, the girl who had cried in the rain, wondering why her father didn't love her enough to keep her safe. She wasn't doing this for that man. She was doing this for herself, for the woman she had become, and for the possibility of finding peace. Hours later, the surgery began. Dr. Carter, the lead surgeon, worked meticulously alongside his team. The room was tense but focused, each movement calculated with precision. When Emily's kidney was successfully removed and transferred to Michael, there was a collective exhale among the medical staff. The operation was a success, at least for now. But as Emily lay unconscious in recovery, and Michael's body adjusted to the new organ, one truth remained clear: this was only the beginning of their journey. When Emily opened her eyes in the recovery room, the world felt blurry and distant. The steady beeping of machines anchored her to the moment, reminding her she was alive. Her body ached, a dull throb emanating from her abdomen. But she ignored it. The first thing she thought of wasn't herself, it was Michael. A nurse approached, her smile gentle. Welcome back, Emily. How are you feeling? Emily swallowed, her throat dry. I'm okay, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. How's my dad? The nurse hesitated for just a moment before answering. He's stable for now. The doctors are keeping a close eye on him. But it's looking positive. Relief washed over Emily, though she still felt a lingering weight. Stable was good, but it wasn't a guarantee. She closed her eyes, exhaustion overtaking her, but her heart clung to the hope that she had given him a chance. Over the next few days, Emily's recovery was swift. Determined to regain her strength, she pushed herself to get out of bed and walk the hospital corridors, much to the surprise of the medical staff. Each step, though painful, was a reminder of why she had made this sacrifice. Her father was alive, and that alone made the discomfort bearable. Yet despite her progress, Emily was haunted by the knowledge that she hadn't yet seen Michael since the surgery. The nurses and doctors offered vague updates about his condition, and she began to grow restless. On the third day, she finally mustered the courage to visit his room. Her legs felt unsteady as she approached the door, her emotions swirling: anxiety, hope, and a lingering anger that she couldn't quite shake. She paused for a moment, her hand resting on the cold metal doorknob, before pushing it open. Michael was awake. His face was pale, the lines of age and exhaustion more pronounced than ever. But his eyes, those piercing grey eyes she had once feared, now held a softness she hadn't seen before. When he noticed her, his lips trembled, as if he were struggling to find the right words. "Emily," he whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. She stepped inside, pulling a chair close to his bedside. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, her own voice trembling. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, laden with years of unspoken pain and regret. Michael finally broke it, his words slow and deliberate. I don't even know where to begin," he said, his voice cracking. "You shouldn't have done this, Emily. After everything I put you through, you shouldn't have." "Stop," she interrupted gently, but firmly. "We've been through this already. I made my choice. I wanted to do this." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "But why? After all the ways I failed you, why would you risk so much to save me?" Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Because it wasn't just about you, Dad. It was about me, too. I've spent years carrying the weight of what happened that night. The anger, the hurt, it stayed with me. And I realized that if I didn't take this chance to help you, I might never find the peace I need." Michael's tears spilled over, streaking his weathered cheeks. "I can't undo what I did," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't take back that night. But I need you to know, Emily, that I regret it every single day. I was so blinded by my own failures, my own expectations, that I forgot what mattered most you." Emily felt her own tears rising, but she held his gaze. "It's going to take time, Dad. A lot of time. But if you're willing to try, maybe we can start over." His hand, weak and trembling, reached out to hers. She hesitated for only a moment before taking it. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination she hadn't heard from him before. The conversation left them both emotionally drained, but for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope between them. Emily stayed by his side that day, their silences no longer heavy but instead filled with the beginnings of understanding. The road ahead would not be easy. Emily knew the scars of the past couldn't be erased overnight. But as she watched her father drift off to sleep, his hand still loosely holding hers, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. This was the start of something new, a chance to rebuild what had been broken and, perhaps, to find healing for them both. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a step. And for Emily, that was enough. The weeks following the surgery were a delicate dance of recovery and reconciliation. Michael remained in the hospital longer than Emily, as his body worked to adjust to the transplant. Emily, though physically weaker at first, recovered quickly and returned to visit him every day. She brought books to read aloud, magazines, or just her presence, offering quiet company during his long stretches of silence. At first, their conversations were tentative, almost awkward. Michael didn't seem to know how to talk to his daughter anymore, and Emily wasn't sure how much of her heart she was ready to expose. But little by little, the walls between them began to crack. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the hospital window, Michael broke the silence. "Emily," he began, his voice hesitant, "do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if I hadn't done what I did?" Emily paused, the question hanging heavily in the air. "Sometimes," she admitted, "I think about it. But not as much as I used to. I've learned that dwelling on the past doesn't help me move forward." Michael nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the window. "I think about it every day," he said quietly. "I think about the life you could have had if I hadn't been so blind. I don't expect you to forgive me, Emily. I just want you to know that I see it now. All the ways I failed you." Emily looked at him, Her heart a mixture of emotions, sadness for the pain they had both endured, anger for the years lost, and a faint glimmer of hope that this conversation could be the start of something better. "Dad," she said gently, "we can't go back and change what happened. But we can try to make things better from here. That's all I want." Michael's eyes filled with tears. But he didn't turn away. "I'll try. Emily. I'll do everything I can to make it right." As the days turned into weeks, Michael kept his promise. He began to open up in ways Emily had never seen before. He asked her questions about her life, what she loved, what she dreamed of, and who she had become in the years they had been apart. For the first time, he wasn't dictating her future but listening to it. Emily, in turn, found herself sharing more and more. She talked about her struggles after he had cast her out, about Mary's kindness and how it had saved her. She told him about the part-time jobs, the night classes, and the slow process of rebuilding her life from the ground up. One day, as they sat together in his hospital room, Emily hesitated before speaking. "Dad," she began, "I've been thinking about going back to school. For real this time. I want to study social work." Michael blinked, his expression one of surprise. "Social work?" he asked. Emily nodded, her confidence growing as she spoke. "I want to help people the way Mary helped me. I want to make a difference in someone else's life." To her surprise, Michael smiled, a soft, genuine smile she hadn't seen in years. "That's wonderful, Emily," he said. "You'd be amazing at it. I'm proud of you." Hearing those words, Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't just the approval she had once craved, it was the knowledge that her father was finally seeing her for who she truly was. When Michael was finally discharged, Emily helped him settle into his home. Though she didn't move in with him, she rented an apartment nearby, determined to maintain her independence while still being close enough to help him recover. Their visits became a daily ritual, and each one brought them closer to understanding and healing. The journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced, when anger and frustration bubbled up. But they faced those moments together, choosing to communicate instead of retreat. Nearly a year after the transplant, Emily stood on the doorstep of Michael's house, holding a letter in her hands. Her face was glowing, her eyes bright with excitement. "Dad," she called as she stepped inside. Michael appeared in the living room, moving slowly but steadily. "What's that?" he asked, gesturing to the envelope in her hand. Emily grinned, holding it up. "It's an acceptance letter. I got into the social work program I applied to." For a moment, Michael simply stared at her, his eyes glistening with pride. Then, without a word, he pulled her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've become such an incredible woman. I don't deserve to call you my daughter, but I'm so grateful that I can." Emily hugged him back, tears streaming down her face. "You're trying, Dad. That's what matters." As they stood together, the sunlight streaming through the windows, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, she truly believed they could face it together. As the seasons changed, so did Emily and Michael. Their journey of healing wasn't perfect, but it was real. Through shared laughter, tears, and long conversations, they discovered something new: the power of forgiveness, love, and the courage to move forward. Emily's decision to donate her kidney had not only saved Michael's life but also rekindled a bond they thought was lost forever. One crisp autumn evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "We've come a long way," Emily said softly, her hand resting on Michael's. Michael nodded, his eyes glistening. "We have. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know how much you mean to me." It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a new beginning, one filled with hope, growth, and the promise of brighter days ahead. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales.